Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're going to be taking a deep dive today into the U.S.-led trade war, and this time it's personal. We're using one of your submitted sources, My News, to break down exactly what's going on, and honestly, the ripples of this thing, well, they could reach right into your wallet.
What's really interesting here is how this entire situation intertwines economics with national security. You see, it's not just about tariffs and trade balances. No, it's about power dynamics and strategic resources.
Okay, so let's try to unpack all of this. The video started with Trump's announcement, right? A 25% tariff, that's 25% on all imports coming from Mexico and Canada.
Oh, and not to mention a 10% tariff on Chinese goods as well.
Yeah, you're right, 10% on Chinese goods. Now his main reason for this, at least what he said, was concerns about fentanyl and drug trafficking. But isn't this also about something bigger here?
It's definitely a multi-layered issue. On the surface, sure, it appears to be about addressing the drug crisis and, protecting national security. But when we really look deeper, it's also a way for the U.S. to exert economic pressure and potentially reshape global trade in its favor.
So how did Canada and Mexico react to this tariff bombshell?
Well, Canada initially came out swinging. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced retaliatory tariffs, basically saying, hey, we won't be pushed around. It was a classic example of what economists call game theory, trying to establish a strong position early on in the game.
Interesting. So it's like a high-stakes poker game where everyone's trying to outmaneuver each other?
Exactly. It's a really good analogy. But then, things took a surprising turn, didn't they? Trump suspended the tariffs for 30 days, but only after both Canada and Mexico pledged to increase their border control efforts. And so Trudeau, he shifted from that fiery defiance to a more cooperative tone, which really highlights just how delicate these trade relationships can be, even between close allies.
So what did Canada actually promise to do? I remember the video mentioned a whole bunch of new measures.
Yeah, they agreed to a whole bunch of stuff. They agreed to increase border personnel, deploy some new helicopters, list certain cartels as terrorist organizations, and even form a joint U.S.-Canada task force. Oh, and also invest a hefty $200 million. These are serious concessions, and they really show just how much Canada relies on smooth trade with the U.S. Their economy really depends on it.
But stepping back for a second, what exactly does a trade deficit mean? The video mentioned that's a big part of Trump's issue with the EU, but what does that even mean in practical terms?
A trade deficit simply means that any country, imports more goods and services than it actually exports, than it sends out. It's like, like spending more money than you earn, which eventually it can become a problem.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, some economists argue that trade deficits are very harmful because they can lead to job losses and a decline in the economy. But others argue that they're just a natural part of, a globalized economy and not necessarily a cause for concern.
And Trump seems to fall into that first camp, right? He views trade deficits as a sign of weakness.
Yes, he does.
But it's interesting that the EU can't just fix a trade deficit the way Canada and Mexico could address drug trafficking concerns. They're two very different things.
That's right. And that's because the EU is a massive and complex economic bloc. Unlike Canada and Mexico, whose economies are more directly tied to the U.S., the EU has a diverse range of trading partners and a more independent economic policy. They're not as likely to bend to pressure from the U.S.
So it sounds like these trade wars are about more than just economics. They're about geopolitics and national pride and the struggle for global influence.
Absolutely. And this brings us to China. Now the 10% tariff on all those Chinese goods, it's already in effect. And in response, China has fired back with, retaliatory tariffs of their own. They're targeting some pretty key U.S. exports like coal and liquefied natural gas and crude oil and even vehicles.
It's not just about tariffs, right? I mean, the video mentioned that China's also taking aim at U.S. companies specifically and also restricting those exports of rare earth minerals. What's the strategy? What's the strategy behind those moves?
China is clearly playing hardball here by launching monopoly investigations into companies like Google, and by restricting those rare earth minerals, which are absolutely crucial for tech and military applications. They're flexing their muscles and they're signaling their willingness to fight back. This is a major escalation of the trade war, and honestly, it has some really, really potentially far-reaching consequences.
But what does this all mean for the average person listening right now? Should we be stocking up on canned goods and building underground bunkers?
Well, maybe not bunkers, but it's certainly wise to pay attention to what's happening. Trade wars have a Well, they have a habit of spilling over into everyday life. And one of the most immediate impacts that you might notice is, well, higher prices.
Right. I remember the video talked about just how much the U.S. relies on those Mexican imports for things like machinery and equipment and agricultural products and even electronics.
Exactly. And it emphasized that shifting all of those supply chains overnight is practically impossible. It just can't be done. So if those tariffs stay in place, well, we could see a pretty significant increase in the cost of all those goods. And let's not forget about all the potential job losses as well. If American businesses start to suffer as a result of these trade wars, well, they might be forced to lay off workers.
So this is much bigger than just a few extra dollars at the checkout line.
Mm-hmm.
This could have ripple effects throughout the entire economy.
Exactly. And it's not just about the economy. No, these trade wars have the potential to damage relationships between countries, to create political instability, and even lead to military conflict.
Wow. That's a sobering thought. So what's next? Where do we go? Where do we even go from here?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But before we dive into all the potential future scenarios, let's take a closer look at, well, the specifics of each trade relationship. My News had some really interesting breakdowns of, well, the U.S.-Mexico and the U.S.-China trade dynamics. I think those are worth exploring in more detail.
All right, sounds good. Let's
be that.
Yeah. Let's start with the U.S.-Mexico relationship. As the video highlighted, it's a very, very deeply intertwined economic partnership.
Yeah, the sheer volume of trade between the two countries, it was pretty eye-opening. I remember My News pointed out that something like 30% of all U.S. imports in sectors like machinery, equipment, agriculture, and even electronics, it all comes directly from Mexico. That's a huge chunk. It is, and it really underscores just how integrated those two economies are. These supply chains they've developed over decades, optimizing for efficiency and cost effectiveness, and the close proximity of the U.S. and Mexico, along with all of those established transportation routes, well, they make it a very, very tightly woven system.
So untangling that web, it wouldn't be easy, I imagine, and definitely not cheap. The video made it sound like trying to just switch suppliers overnight would be a logistical nightmare.
Oh, absolutely. And not just logistically, it would also likely result in much higher costs for U.S. businesses, which of course always get passed on to consumers, to you.
Okay, so that's the import side of things. But what about U.S. exports to Mexico? Is it just a one-way street, or is there a benefit for the U.S. as well?
Oh, no, it's definitely a two-way street. My News showed that the U.S. exports a significant amount of goods to Mexico as well. I think it was something like 25% of all U.S. metal and electronics exports, those go directly to Mexico.
So both countries really rely heavily on this trade relationship. Mm-hmm. It really highlights just how complex this entire situation is. It's not just about the U.S., dictating terms. There are real consequences for both sides.
Precisely. And those consequences could even ripple outwards, impacting global markets and economies far, far beyond North America. Now, shifting gears a little bit to China, their response to these tariffs has been, particularly interesting.
Yeah, My News really painted a picture of China, pushing back strategically. Mm-hmm. They're hitting the U.S. with tariffs on some pretty key exports, like we already discussed. But then there's that whole other thing about the monopoly investigation into Google. That felt like a pretty big escalation to me.
It is. You see, Google is a major player in the global tech industry, and China represents a massive market for them. If Google were to be, restricted or even banned in China, it would be a significant blow to the company, and it could trigger, some pretty big shockwaves throughout the entire tech world.
It almost feels like China is using this trade war as an opportunity to kind of reshape the global landscape. And not just in terms of trade, but also in terms of technological dominance.
That's a very perceptive observation. You see, China has been strategically investing in key technologies for years now, and this trade war, it could accelerate that trend. They're also leveraging their control over rare earth minerals, which are essential for many, many high-tech industries.
Right. My News explained how China is actually restricting exports of these minerals.
Yeah.
And that could put the U.S. at a disadvantage. especially when it comes to things like advanced manufacturing and military technology.
Exactly. China controls a significant portion of the global supply of these minerals. And by limiting access to them, well, they're creating a pressure point for the US and for other countries. It's a reminder that these trade wars aren't just about tariffs. They're about control over strategic resources and the power that comes with it.
So what does this all mean for the average person? We talked about those higher prices and potential job losses and even the risk of military conflict. It all feels pretty doom and gloom.
It's certainly a serious situation, but it's not all doom and gloom. This trade war, it also presents an opportunity. It forces us to examine our consumption habits, to think critically about where the products we buy, where they come from, and to consider, the hidden costs that are associated with our choices.
You're right. Maybe this is like a wake-up call for all of us to be more conscious consumers, to support businesses that operate, ethically and sustainably.
Exactly. By making more informed choices, we can collectively shape a more just and a more sustainable global economy.
That's a much more hopeful way to look at it. So while those short-term consequences of this trade war, they might be painful, maybe it's also a chance for us to build a better future in the long run.
It is. And I think it's important to remember that, the future isn't, it's not predetermined. It's up to us to shape it. We have agency and we can choose to be part of the solution, not the problem.
I like that. But before we get too carried away with all this optimism, the My News video did mention a pretty scary possibility. And that was a global recession. A global recession triggered by this trade war. Is that really a possibility we need to be worried about?
It's definitely a possibility we need to take seriously. Remember, trade wars can disrupt global supply chains and reduce business investment and even dampen, consumer spending. All of those things can contribute to a slowdown in economic growth.
So it's like a chain reaction. One disruption just leads to another, and before you know it, the whole system just starts to crumble.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to find a way to de-escalate this whole situation. We need to move away from this tit for tat approach and start looking for solutions that benefit everyone, not just one side or the other.
Easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you have, powerful leaders with very, very strong personalities all vying for control. But I guess that's where diplomacy comes in.
Diplomacy is crucial. We need to create spaces for dialogue where countries can come together and work out their differences, but peacefully. We need to recognize that we're all interconnected and that our fates are, they're intertwined. What happens in one part of the world will eventually affect everyone else.
I remember My News touched upon the historical context of trade wars.
Yeah.
And it was clear that they rarely end well. Is there anything we can learn from those past mistakes? Anything that might help us navigate this current situation?
That's a great question, and it's something we should definitely explore further. The past can offer some valuable lessons, but it's also important to recognize that this particular trade war is unique in many ways. The global economy is much more interconnected than it was in the past, and the rise of new technologies, that adds a whole new layer of complexity.
Mm. So we can't just copy and paste solutions from the past. We need to find new and innovative approaches that address the specific challenges of the 21st century.
Absolutely. We need to be creative and flexible and willing to adapt to a rapidly changing landscape.
Yeah. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored the complexities of U.S.-Mexico and the U.S.-China trade relationships. We've talked about the potential for a global recession, and we've even touched upon the need for diplomacy and cooperation and even conscious consumerism. It's been a real deep dive into a truly complex and challenging issue.
It has, and I hope our listeners have come away with a better understanding of the forces that are shaping our world and the role that we can all play in shaping a more just and a more sustainable future.
Me too. But My News didn't really cover the looming threat of tariffs on the European Union. It definitely seems like a significant piece of the puzzle.
It is, and it's
Yeah.
a piece that could have some very major implications for the global economy.
So let's shift our focus to the EU and see if we can unpack what's at stake there. So let's shift our focus to the EU and see if we can unpack what's at stake there.
Okay, sounds good.
The video did mention that his main issue with the EU is the trade deficit, right? The fact that the U.S. imports more from the EU than it actually exports. But we also talk about how the EU can't really fix a trade deficit the way Canada and Mexico addressed drug trafficking concerns. Those are two very different things. So what happens next? What are the potential scenarios here?
Well, one possibility is that the U.S. and the EU, they managed to negotiate a trade deal, one that addresses at least some of Trump's concerns without resorting to tariffs. I think that would be the most ideal outcome, because it would avoid, further economic disruption and maintain some stability in global markets.
That sounds like the best case scenario.
Yeah.
But is it realistic? Given the current political climate, Trump seems pretty set on using tariffs as a negotiating tactic.
Yeah, you're right. It's not going to be easy. Trust between the U.S. and the EU has been strained in recent years, and there are some significant differences in their approaches to, trade and economic policy. But diplomacy it's never easy, and sometimes the most difficult path is the one worth taking.
So what happens if those negotiations fail? What if Trump actually follows through on his threat to impose tariffs on all those European goods?
Well, that's where things could get really messy. The EU has already indicated that they're going to retaliate. They're going to retaliate with tariffs of their own if the U.S. takes that approach.
Yeah.
And so we could see, a tit for tat escalation that just spirals out of control, leading to a full-blown trade war between the world's two largest economies.
And that would be bad.
Right.
Like really bad for everyone.
It would be extremely damaging, not just for the U.S. and the EU, but for the entire global economy. Remember we talked about that, the interconnectedness of global markets. A trade war between the U.S. and the EU would disrupt supply chains, and it would increase prices, and it would reduce consumer confidence all around the world. And
we're already seeing some of those effects, right? Mm-hmm. With the tariffs that are already in place on China. If we add the EU to the mix, it's hard to imagine how it wouldn't lead to a global recession.
It's a very, very real concern, and it's something that policymakers really need to be taking seriously. The stakes they're incredibly high.
So what can be done to prevent this worst case scenario from actually happening?
Yeah.
Is there any hope for a peaceful resolution?
There's always hope, but
yeah.
It's going to require a pretty big shift in mindset. Both sides need to move away from this zero-sum mentality that has really dominated these trade negotiations for so long. They need to recognize that cooperation, not conflict, is the path to shared prosperity.
My news touched upon the idea that trade wars are often they're about more than just economics. They're about power and influence and even national pride. How do those factors, how do they play into the situation with the EU?
Well, they play a very significant role. You see, the EU has emerged as a major economic and political force in its own right, and it's not going to simply their own interests to protect, and they're willing to fight for them. This creates a very, very complex dynamic, one where economics and geopolitics are very, very tightly intertwined.
So it's not just about who sells the most cars or who makes the cheapest smartphones. It's about who gets to set the rules, who gets to set the rules of the global game.
Exactly, and that's what makes this whole trade war so significant. It's not just about tariffs and trade deficits. It's about the future of global power and the shape of the international order.
So what does this all mean for the average person listening to this? What can we do to navigate this crazy, complex and uncertain landscape?
Well, one thing we can all do is to stay informed and to stay engaged. Don't just rely on, headlines and sound bites. Dig deeper, explore different perspectives and challenge your own assumptions.
Right. And don't be afraid to ask questions, even if they seem naive. The more we understand about the forces that are shaping our world, well, the better equipped we'll be to make informed decisions.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power. And when we empower ourselves with knowledge, well, we can start to reclaim our agency and shape a future that aligns with our values.
So it's not about feeling overwhelmed or powerless. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in shaping this new world order.
Exactly. And that role starts with understanding the complexities of issues like this trade war.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from Trump's initial tariff announcements to the potential for a global recession. We've explored all those complexities, the complexities of trade relationships with Canada and Mexico and China and the EU, and we've talked about the need for diplomacy and cooperation and even conscious consumerism. It's been a real deep dive into a truly complex and challenging issue.
It has, and I really hope our listeners have come away with a much better understanding of the forces that are shaping our world and the role that we can all play in shaping a more just and a more sustainable future.
I hope so too. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep engaging with the world around you.